Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Street Peace Coalition on Chicago Cable Access, CAN TV, Channel 21 in Chicago. I am your host on behalf of the Street Peace Coalition, Minister Michael Muhammad, one of the co-founders of the Street Peace Coalition. We are a grassroots organization that is dedicated to direct positive action against senseless acts of violence in the black community specifically. We have tasked ourselves with meeting potential shooters, being available to talk to potential shooters, to be available to mediate conflicts between individuals and other groups that may have potential violent conflict. We have grown out of work we've done over the years through Torchlight Interfaith Ministries, and so this work has grown out of the recognition that those who have made a contribution to the violence have some responsibility to now come back, give back, and try to repair some of the damage one may have been associated with or directly responsible. And so we don't necessarily focus on police brutality. We focus on black violence. And that is by our intent, because we know and believe and know that when we as members of the community begin to value one another properly in a more mature, more rational, more sane, if you will, way, when we begin to value those that live with us, those that are our family members, those that are our extended family members, those that are our neighbors, the children of people who are really a part of us, then we will begin to change the lifestyle and the things in our lifestyle that lead us to perpetuate senseless, random acts of violence against one another, or premeditated acts of violence based upon something that is not worthy of violence. And so violence in the black community for the last 15 years or so has undergone a transformation. And so while violence was highly organized for most of the history of street organizations or so-called gangs, for the most part, in Chicago has a history and legacy of having organized groups that had rules or codes or standards, if you will, that were created to regulate and manage human behavior, even inside of groups that some people view as counter productive to society. They had rules in Chicago, and so you would be held accountable for the rules. And so those boundaries, those safe spaces have all been transformed by a number of factors, the least of which are under the control of so-called street organizations or gangs. The factors that have transformed violence have everything to do with the commoditization and the dehumanization of black people through various institutions that have contributed to the destabilization of black family, of male-female households where a father and a mother is present to provide a balance, a gender balanced structure, a gender balanced presence that tended to produce a better quality of human being, that even when the human being became involved in street life, the majority would be given credit for understanding the boundaries between those in the street life and those that we might call civilians that were not a part of the street life. And so there were always boundaries among young people, that if you were an athlete, the most heinous, the most notorious of our thugs or gangsters, if you will, respected the fact that you were not a part of their world. In fact, you will probably be protected in their world when they realize that that is what you were dedicated to. If you were what we might call a bookworm or an egghead, those in the street life, once they understood that that was your path, for the most part, they understood that they gave you your space. They gave you a safe passage. So the rules, those rules have dramatically shifted. But it did not start on the street. It started in the home. And so the war on drugs and its tentacles, if we don't deal with the effect of the war on drugs and how it played out in the black community and its deleterious effect, its negative effect on black family, then we are not being honest about how we're producing the kind of violence that seems so reckless, so out of control, that we seem to be producing human beings that have a derangement about them that seems unusual. We are producing more people with sociopathic and even psychopathic traits, tendencies, and behavior than we ever have in our history as a community of people. I'm talking about black people. What is going on? You cannot blame this on street organizations because they themselves are a victim of a larger process, a larger shift in the quality of human beings being produced by the major habilitative institutions in society. People do not have the same quality character in 2017 as they even had in 1997 or 1967. We live in an age where social standards have been lowered. And when you lower social standards, when you allow policies, laws, rules, ordinances to be put in place that attack the most vulnerable of us, when you allow a group of people to be grossly demonized, devalued to justify those policies, then it's going to produce an effect. When you are committed to demonize, monsterizing millions of young black men and incarcerating them, undereducating them, incarcerating them, trapping them in a complex, what we call the prison industrial complex, But it's called that because it is an economic engine. And if you're determined to fuel that economic engine with the bodies of the children who have been produced by parents whom you stigmatized, stereotyped, demonized, and now you monsterize their children, now you are creating what we call and know to be social engineering. And so it is no different from when we go to the movies and we see scientists who've unlocked certain codes of life. And so they produce a Manchurian Candidate. They produce a Jason Bourne. They develop a James Bond. Or they talk about the principles of social, biologic, genetic engineering in fictional movies such as the X-Men. So these are things that dramatize truths about how our society functions and the way the power elite think about those of us under their rule. And so you have a byproduct. You have a byproduct of that. And so we live in the day of the byproduct. And so now it is becoming less unusual to hear about black men in particular who are what we would consider psychopathic or all the way up to mass murderous. When this just a few short years ago was almost unheard of from the black community. It was almost a phenomenon that produced itself almost exclusively outside of the black community. So now something is happening. Is it in the water? Is it in the food? Is it in the educational process? Is it from the impact of mass media? Let us question ourselves and let us question society to understand how is today's human being being produced? And what makes today's human being so vulnerable to the stressors, the anxieties, the challenges, the struggles of life that one becomes murderous of innocent people? What makes our young men willing to shoot into crowds, at funerals, at burials, in school, at athletic events? A few days ago, there was a carnival, or there still is a carnival, and the young people went there and began, it was a shootout. And so what makes our young people like that? What makes our daughters even now so vicious that they take pride, their rite of passage as a young lady is actually learning how to fight? What happened to us as a people? Is this random? Is this accidental? Are we just like this by nature? And if we are, why has it taken us to the 2000s for these kind of tendencies to come out among us as a people? And so I have to see, I have a caller. Is a caller there? I want to.
Yes. Hello.
All right. How you doing, caller?
Yes, I wanted to make a couple of points, if I might. One, it's important to note that even though we see a spike in crime currently in the city of Chicago, that nationally we are still at historic lows. The murder rate and violent crime rate in this country is down from what it was in the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s. We are on a 20-year low that has just recently begun to go up slightly, but we are still lower than we were in the early 90s, throughout the 80s, throughout the 70s. And it's also the case that because of introduction of things like DNA testing, that we now know that we actually had serial killers and mass murderers in parts of minority communities that no one had known about in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that we only are now discovering because we can test with DNA evidence. So the fact is that law enforcement simply didn't care when large numbers of people were being killed in minority communities, and now we know that there were serial killers that were operating in African American communities in the 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s.
Thank you, caller. Well, I agree in part with you, caller. The stats are lower than they have been over a span. But what I'm speaking about is the nature of the violence that's going on in the black community, not the white community, the black community. And so those of us who live the black experience understand what I'm saying. Yes, we have always had killers in our community, but I would like to see the evidence. I have yet to see a study or evidentiary material that supports that we had mass murderers. And when I say mass murderers, I mean the likes of a Jeffrey Dahmer, a John Wayne Gacy, men or women who went out and just picked victims from some randomized, irrational state of disassociation from reality and fulfilling some internal video or fantasy or depravity. Yes, we've had a lot of serious killers in the black community, but again, generally those killers would walk among us and you would be safe around them because they recognize that you were not in the world of that crime life that made you a target. And so the numbers are low, but the nature of the violence is different in the black community than it has ever been. And I have been doing this violence prevention intervention work for quite some time, for at least 3 decades. For about 3 decades. And so there's something different going on in the black community. And so that is what I'm speaking about. See, sometimes it's not just about quantity, sometimes it's about the quality. And so when the qualities of violence shift, we must pay attention to that the same way we pay attention to the quantity of violence. And so if we have an outbreak or if we develop a trend of someone, God forbid, someone just beginning to a trend toward people randomly committing open air acts of mortal violence against infants, well, that would begin to stick out. We wouldn't need that to match a certain quantity. We would look at the character of it. We would look at the quality of it, because it would provoke a different kind of outrage from anything we've seen before. And so that's what I'm speaking about. There is a quality to the violence that is going on. There is a certain characteristic to the perpetrators of violence that it lacks the control mechanisms that have been traditional in our community that afforded individuals like myself the opportunity to be more effective in intervening in conflict, because there was structure, there was code, there was rules, there was a certain quality of human being, even though they might be viewed as above the law or beyond the law in the street life. There was still a certain quality of individual who understood that when Big Mama come on the porch, you stop what you're doing. When Mama walk down the street, there is no gunplay, there is no vendetta, there is no shootout. When little children are playing on the playground, you don't go and shoot randomly, because you're going to be held accountable to a certain standard that provided boundaries for those involved in acts of violence. And so let's not confuse quality and quantity. Both are relevant, but I'm speaking about quality, the qualities of the violence that exists in the black community, the quality of the mind of black people now that are committing acts of violence on other black people. That is not that has never existed before. It is just above the norm, or it is very unusual. And so before we go any further, I want to go to our overhead because we've got an event coming up that I really hope that you will have it in your heart to think about supporting. We are doing an effort to bring the community together to galvanize resources to help us keep our efforts going throughout the summer. So we're sponsoring a father and son breakfast with the theme "Love Not Lock Up." In other words, let's come together as fathers, as older brothers, uncles, what have you, with those that should look up to us and those whom we should be responsible for as the adults, if you will. Let's come together and show them what black men, strong, positive black men look like, who are committed to being better role models and better examples to the community. And so we hope you will come out and join us on Saturday morning of April 29th from 9 a.m. to noon at 4100 West Jackson in Garfield, at Garfield Park Community Baptist Church, a beautiful facility on the west side. The pastor there has been gracious enough to allow us to hold this event so we can invite the community in. So we hope you'll join us on that Saturday. If you want more information about this, you can hit us on Facebook, inbox us on Facebook at facebook.com Street Peace Coalition, and we'll get right back to you. You can also contact us on the World Wide Web at the Street Peace Coalition.weebly.com. You can shoot us an email through the contact form on the website, and we'd be love to give you more information and make sure that you can attend this event, or you can support it even if you don't intend on attending. Maybe you can make help someone else attend this event. And so that's coming up in a few short days, April 29th. So, as I was saying, you know, everybody is, the internet and the black community is abuzz now because we had this young man in Cleveland who evidently was already a little social psychopathic and nobody paid attention to it, or he had a complete break with all rationality and performed a heinous act on a older gentleman who was totally innocent, just an innocent victim, a very heinous crime. Well, as I said, we've had some serious killers in our community. But by and large, those serious killers were dealing with other serious criminals. By and large, not absolutely, but for the majority of times, this kind of behavior is very unusual for those of us who, you know, are older than 25. This is why everybody is trying to figure out what is going on in the community, but no one is giving honest answers. Everybody is blaming gangs. Everybody is giving the solution as jobs. This is not an issue of jobs. Violence in the black community has very little to do with the availability of jobs. It has everything to do with how we feel about ourselves. It has everything to do with the standards that we have for what it means to be who we are and what we are. And until we start to give honest answers about the nature of violence and craft solutions based upon those honest answers, we will be scratching our heads continue to scratch our heads moving forward. So this is the end of our time for this episode of the Street Peace Coalition. We thank all of you who tuned in and didn't call in. We thank the caller who called in and posed his viewpoint and question. We hope that you will join us again next week, same time, same station, right here at CAN TV, Channel 21 in Chicago. Thank you.